I want to use my remaining time to talk and introduce you to the Social Connectedness Index. Perfect. We've seen a lot on the data challenges, and I just showed you that part of our agenda has been using these data from online social networks such as Facebook to measure peers and to speak to peer effects. One issue we still have, however, is that we need to connect this data on peers with information about socio-economic activity with the outcomes we want to study. The approach one that I just showed you an example of, and that Johannes will show you a second example right after, is combine Facebook social graph with data on individual level outcomes. So we've done this for the housing market, looking at housing as well as mortgage choice. I just showed you this on cell phone adoption. We have some ongoing work where we do this for social mobility. The big challenge is that there are just limited outcome variables that we have at the individual level that we can match to this data. And this is also something that's not easily scalable because, as you might imagine, there's a lot of headache and work involved into matching this. So what I want to introduce you to is a second approach. And this approach is saying, an alternative way of working with this data is aggregating it to a geographic level where we can measure economic activity. That has two advantages. Once we aggregate it to some geographic level, we have a lot of economic outcomes. We have those measurements, and so we can just use this huge wealth of data out there to study the outcomes. Second, of course, this makes it more scalable. Once I have data at the geographical level, I can more easily share it because any times of privacy questions are just a lot less of a concern. So we introduced what we're going to call the Social Connectedness Index. The underlying data is an anonymized snapshot of the Facebook social graph. I probably don't have to introduce Facebook to you. I just want to say it's really big, and so it has a lot of people, which is great for this purpose. And it mostly measures kind of real-life friends and acquaintances. We have some studies in the US that actually show that most people on Facebook have met their Facebook friends multiple times in real life. So we define the social connectedness based on these friendship links as the number of friendship links normalized by the number of Facebook users in each location. What this measure does, it looks a little bit unintuitive at first, but what this measure does, it allows us to measure to construct a measure that you can interpret as the relative probability of friendship links between Facebook users. So if we double the social connectedness, it means that a user in location I is twice as likely to be friends with the user in location J than if this measure were half. It also nicely allows us to measure social connectedness independent of differences in population or in the usage of Facebook across locations, because we're normalizing by how many people are even in these locations. What are these locations that we have the social connectedness available? It is now available for US counties, for US zip codes, for all international countries, or the vast majority of international countries, as well as for sub-national regions. In the EU, this is NUTS 2 and NUTS 3. What that exactly is depends a little bit on which country you're looking at, as well as GADM bonds, which is also sub-national level that's defined internationally. The important thing, and I really want to point that out, is that this data is available and you can just download it from Facebook's Data for Good website. You can go there and 5 minutes later, this data is on your computer. So hopefully this will allow a lot of people to work with it and learn about social networks. Okay, let me show you a little bit what is in this data and how it looks. I'm going to start with US counties. This is San Francisco County and its connections to the rest of the US. San Francisco is up here, the dark green one, in California. And I want you to compare this to Kern County, which is home to Bakersfield, also in California, but in the Central Valley. What you see here is that the San Francisco has these large connections to basically all urban centers across the US. That makes sense. San Francisco is one of these big urban centers that has connections to all other parts, especially also to the upper northeast, to the New England states across the US. Kern County, very, very different. Almost no connections to the East Coast, but much stronger connections to the rest of the western part. I want to point out a few things. We see these strong links to North Dakota. And so one thing I learned about Bakersfield, it is actually one of the largest oil-producing counties in the US. And so we think this is likely due to those connections in the oil industry. Second, you see these links to Oklahoma. And this was a little bit surprising for us to see, but once we dug in, we learned that during the Dust Bowl at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a substantial number of migrants that moved from Oklahoma to Bakersfield. And we think these connections are a legacy of that migration within the US. We see something similar for Chicago. So these are the connections for Cook County, which is the home of Chicago. And you see these strong links all the way south to the Mississippi, down here. And this is likely a result of the Great Migration, where after the Civil Rights Movement, many African Americans moved north to work in the industries and factories in Chicago, but they kept their links to their original locations, where they also often still had family members and friends, and those have persisted over the recent decades. Finally, we see Menominee County, Wisconsin. And what I want to point out here is this big link to the Navajo Nation. Why is that? Well, Menominee County is an Indian reservation, and you can see those strong links to all those other counties dotted around the west, where we have Indian reservations. Finally, this is Erie County, Buffalo. And what sticks out here is how strongly you can see New York state lines on the map. Like friendship really drop off at the state lines. You also see strong connections to Florida that might not be surprising if you've ever spent the winter in Buffalo. Okay, so we've seen some examples of networks of individual locations. What we see here is that there's a big difference in the geographic dispersion of social networks. So what we've plotted here is the share of friends that people have that live within 50 miles. So, and the lighter the color in the map, the more concentrated locally these friends are. And what you see here is that there are like these big differences across the US in where how widespread those social networks are. Much more concentrated networks in the South, in those Appalachia in the Midwest, than we see on the East Coast or on the West Coast. That was the US. Now I want to show you a little bit about international social connectedness. We have this for 3 types of geography. The first one is social connectedness of US counties to or zip codes to international countries, then from country to country, and finally for regions within countries. This is the connectedness of US counties to Mexico. Maybe not surprisingly, it really has a lot more connections. First of all, on the southern parts on the border to Mexico, but also in all those regions where we have a lot of immigration from Mexico. This is Norway, and Norway similarly has still many strong links to those parts of the country that traditionally had a large immigrant population from Norway. But unlike in Mexico, where this is very recent immigration, some of this immigration from Norway lies more than 100 years in the past, but still shows up here. Now we have the international connectedness, country to country. Here we have Portugal. The things that really stick out once you move to the country level is how much history, and especially colonial history, still shapes those connections today. So for Portugal, we see these strong links to Brazil, the other Portuguese-speaking country, as well as to the former Portuguese colonies in Africa. Very similar for France here. It really is the former colonies that light up when we look at international connectedness between countries. Now we're still in Europe and we are zoning in on different European regions. What I'm showing you here is a region in Italy, Bolzano. This is Tyrol, and this actually is a German-speaking region of Italy. So compare this region to its neighbor, Trento, which is an Italian-speaking region, and we see how language also shapes those connections. Much stronger links to the German-speaking parts of the rest of Europe in Bolzano than we have in Trento. We see something similar when we look at Switzerland. So this is Geneva relative to another part of Switzerland, the Zentralschweiz, and you see how the French-speaking part has much stronger links to France, but also to Italy, to like the Roman language-speaking areas of Europe relative to the German-speaking part. So summing up, what seems to be affecting social connectedness in the data? The first thing is clearly geography. We saw that for the US, we just saw that for Europe, closeness, how close you are to other people is one of the main influencing factors. The other thing that this hinted at is homophily. So the more similar areas are, the more connected we see them to be. We see this for all types of demographics, income, education, religion, political orientation, ethnicity, and so on. And we also saw it very strongly for language, especially internationally. Finally, history really manifests in these patterns. We saw hinted at migration, colonial history, but also historical borders. Countries that were once part of the same empire are still much, much more connected. So with that, I'm gonna pass on the torch to Johannes, who's gonna speak to you very briefly about the research papers that we have on using, or that people have done using the social connectedness index, before he then is gonna talk about a micro level data set.
Perfect. All right. So what I want to do is I want to start out by just re-emphasizing some of the things that that Teresa said about the research in this overall area on peer effects in household finance, in the sense that to me, when I think about the field, it looks it is to me like one of the most one of the most important and understudied parts of household finance. And I think a central reason why it is so understudied relative to, I think, its importance, Teresa motivated why it's very natural that for sort of rare important financial decisions, you would reach out to your friends and you would interact with your network to acquire information. One of the reasons it's understudied is really because of this measurement challenge, right? That, and we'll see sort of in all the papers that we'll present today, and that some of the other presenters will talk about today, they all have some sort of really cool data element to them. But in general, this ability to find social network data is quite challenging. And so that's really the motivation behind us trying to kind of create the social connectedness index and to work with Facebook to generate this product that can be shared broadly with other researchers, like you, because I think it helps and it opens the doors for you to also do work in this space, even if you don't sort of have access to, say, a proprietary data set or something like that. And so one of the really nice advantages then of this index is that once you aggregate it, say, to the US county level, or you aggregate it to the zip code level, or you aggregate it to sort of Indian regions or European regions, whatever it is, you can then take it and merge it to whatever other data sets you have that measure various aspects of economic activity at that very same sort of level of geographic aggregation. And so what I want to do next is just spend a few minutes just describing a bunch of papers, both that we've written with this paper, but also that other researchers have written with this paper, with this data, just to give you a flavor of the types of topics that you can think about working on with this specific data set. So the first paper is this paper, Social Connectedness, Measurement, Determinants, and Effects in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And that was really the first paper we did in this agenda. It really defines and introduces the Social Connectedness Index and explores some of these patterns at the US county level. But one of the things we do in this paper, if we show that social connectedness is correlated with county-to-county migration flows today. So people are more likely to move between counties when they know people in the other counties. We find that social connectedness between counties is correlated with patent citations across the counties. So it's more likely that you're going to cite a patent from an inventor who lives in a county to which you have very strong social connections than to another investor. And I think that sort of links very nicely to, say, the endogenous growth literature, where innovation and ideas are exchange are part of this human interaction aspect. And so you can see it in the patent citation data. You also see it in the state level trade flow data. So just kind of in a correlational sense, just showing how a lot of important economic activity correlates with this measure of social connectedness that we produce. And then the other thing we do in that paper is we explore how the geographic concentration of social networks, if you remember that blue map that Teresa had a few slides ago, where you can see what share of your friends lives really close by versus far away, how that's correlated with socioeconomic outcomes. And one of the things, for example, you see is that social mobility is much, much higher in places that have more dispersed social networks. Causality here is somewhat hard to pin down, but it's at least consistent with stories where dispersed social networks provide you access to useful information and things like that, allowing you to kind of hear about job opportunities and potentially work your way out of poverty. There's a second paper we have in the Journal of Urban Economics, Social Connectedness in Urban Areas, where rather than looking at sort of counties across the US, we're looking at the patterns of social connectedness across New York City zip codes. And what we focus on in that paper is to document that social connectedness varies substantially more with public transit infrastructure than it does with geographic distance. And again, if you think about sort of from an urban economics perspective, the reason cities are so special and the reason cities are so productive, in the urban economics literature is because of agglomeration externalities. The idea that when you bring lots of people together, they meet with each other, they constantly interact, and that makes cities productive. Now that only works if people who live with each other in the same city actually interact with each other in the same city. And so it's kind of interesting to look at this social structure of cities at the zip code level. And again, we do it for New York City, but it's in principle possible to do this for all US cities. But then importantly, it kind of highlights how important it is to have good public transit infrastructure if you want people from all across the city to interact with each other. And so, one of the other things we find in that paper is that this public transit infrastructure is particularly important when you're thinking about providing connections between poor and rich regions. So rich and rich regions, they kind of interact with each other or friends with each other even in the absence of public transport. Same with poor to poor regions, but poor to rich regions, sort of those types of links that might help sort of relatively poor people to get out of poverty. Public transit does a really important job here. So again, kind of a paper really focusing on sort of the urban social connectedness and how it interacts with public transit infrastructure. Then we have a paper where we study the social connectedness in Europe. So again, it's now looking at the European data, and sort of just two patterns that struck us, from that research paper. The first one is how long-lasting the effects of political unions are, right? So one of the things you see, for example, very quite strongly in that data, that sort of European regions that used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire now more than 100 years ago are still more likely to be connected today, even after controlling for today's borders, language similarity and lots of other controls. So there seems to be this really persistent effect of political unions. The other thing that we found in that specific paper is that social connectedness to other European countries is actually negatively associated with Euroscepticism. Right, so it's when you look at at sort of surveys across Europe or voting for anti-European Union parties, right? Usually the only people that vote for anti-European parties are those people that don't know anyone else in other European countries. The more you know people in other European countries, the more likely you are to vote for pro-European parties. So that was an interesting finding here. We have another paper where we look at international trade patterns. So this is now looking at the country-to-country data and trying to understand how trade flows correlate with social connectedness. And one of the things we find is that they correlate very strongly. So trade flows So trade flows are strongly, actually it says increasing, it should say here, in social connectedness. So two places that are more socially connected with each other, they're much more likely to trade. Now what's important is in the trade literature, the types of gravity regressions that people have been running, right, trying to explain sort of trade flows. One of the things that usually shows up strongly in those regressions is geographic distance. And one of the things that people have always found hard to explain is why distance matters so much for trade, in particular for products where, that aren't very expensive to ship. And so one of the things we find is that once you control for the social connectedness between places, the effect of geographic distance goes away almost entirely, sort of suggesting that really what geographic distance was picking up before in these gravity regressions is as a proxy for some type of social interactions. We also find that social interactions are much more important for trading between countries with a weak rule of law. And that makes sense if you think that social connections are some sort of substitute for formal contract enforcement, right? Everyone might be willing to trade with Germany because in Germany you have a good court system, and so you don't really need to know someone very well in order to be willing to trade with them. If they're going to cheat you down the road, you're going to get a good court judgment. On the other hand, if you're trading with countries where the legal system isn't as reliable, maybe you really want to be sure that you know and trust the person you're trading with before you actually engage in trading. We also find that social connections are more important for trade in more sophisticated products. So, products where there's potential for substantial information asymmetry. Said differently, if you want to trade coal with each other, coal is a very homogenized product. I don't need to know someone to be able to trade coal, but in order to trade sort of computer chips, it really matters that we know someone there. In the paper, we spend a lot of effort ruling out that this is due to reverse causality, right? So that it's not the fact that, we trade a lot with each other and in the process, we build up the social networks, but really that it is, we build up the social networks and then as a result, it facilitates trade. The other thing we show sort of more directly related to finance is that asset flows are also increasing in social connectedness, and in particular equity-based investments, which are very information sensitive. So you're much more likely to buy stocks in a country, or firms in a country when you have strong connections. There's a much smaller effect for buying bonds, which are much less informationally sensitive. So again, suggesting that one of the things these social connections allow you to do is overcome information frictions. And then lastly, we have a paper where we look at the role that social connectedness has within the US in terms of explaining mutual fund investments. So this is sort of a core bread and butter topic of the finance literature. And so what we show is that investors are more likely to invest in firms in regions that are socially connected to where the fund is located. Right? And we think that this is largely due to some sort of salience or information story, in particular because we find that the social connectedness matters much, much more for smaller firms or firms that don't have a lot of analyst coverage. Said differently, you don't need friends in Cupertino to know about Apple. And so investments in firms like Apple are really unaffected by whether or not you live in a place that's very socially connected to Cupertino. But for small firms that might be harder to learn about otherwise, these social connections matter much, much more. The other thing that we do in this paper is really starting to go in this direction of studying the aggregate implications of these types of social networks. Because one of the things you saw before in some of these maps is that there's sort of systematic differences at the county level in terms of what parts of the country you're connected to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to define this concept called social proximity to capital. It's a county level concept, and it basically measures how socially connected a county is to other parts of the US where there's a lot of institutional capital. And what we show is that firms that are located in places with strong connections to institutional capital, firms that have a higher social proximity to capital, those firms have higher valuations, higher liquidity, etc. So this was kind of, along the lines of what Teresa was saying earlier on, that, one of the directions in which this literature can be moving is to really try and understand aggregate implications of these types of peer effects that you and social interactions that you document in the data. There's a lot of other researchers that have started doing work with the social connectedness index data. So, Riley Wilson, studies how the adoption of earned income tax credit claiming behavior spreads through social network. Just yesterday or day before, I was sent a paper by a researcher who shows that when a county is socially exposed to regions that are hit by hurricanes, people in those counties buy more flood insurance. So again, it's information about, climate risk or hurricane risk exposure that flows through these social networks. We wrote a paper in the spring, a short one, that shows that you can actually predict the spread of COVID-19 based on this type of social connectedness measure. Again, the idea is, COVID-19 spreads through human interactions. If you're trying to figure out which locations interact more with each other, knowing which locations are more connected with each other is going to be, a very important element here. And so, as one more paper I want to mention, all of these were essentially written this year because this is a literature that's just starting that shows that bank lending is increasing in the social connectedness between places. And so the idea here is not to kind of give you the details about any one of these papers, but it's really to give you a sense of the breadth of topics that can be studied, just with this aggregated social connectedness data. And so I want to again leave you with the, with the URL. You can also get it from my website with the link. As Teresa said, there's no more NDA, nothing like that. You can just download the data. It's a really simple format. And you can think about how that data helps you sort of answer the types of questions that you're studying in your own research. This could be household finance, but it could be corporate finance, could be asset pricing, could be public economics. I think it's just a huge range of topics that open up, to studying how, social networks affect this or how they affect that once you actually have this more aggregated measure of social connectedness. So we're very excited that Facebook has been, willing to work with us to put out this data set, so sort of a broader research community. And, I know some of you are working with it already, but, I really want to encourage as many of you to kind of check it out and see if this is something that, that becomes useful, for your own research.